The day I asked my daughter-in-law for $40, she looked at me like I had already become a problem. I noticed it in the half-second pause before she smiled. Not the warm smile she used at birthdays, not the polished one she wore in family photos, but something thinner. Something measured. "Of course, Margaret," Courtney said, her voice smooth as cream, her hand resting lightly on the marble kitchen island. "If things are that tight, you really should have said something sooner." She said it gently. Kindly, even. But there was a shift in the room so small most people would have missed it. I didn't. I had spent 40 years raising a son, 30 years reading rooms, and long enough being a woman to know the difference between concern and assessment. That was the moment I understood Courtney wasn't surprised I needed help. She was relieved. I sat at her kitchen counter in the same beige coat I'd owned for 12 winters, the cuffs softened with age, the hem slightly worn. I had parked my old Bic in the driveway on purpose. I had mentioned, just once, that my pharmacy bill had gone up and I'd been trying to stretch the month a little farther than usual. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. Just enough to sound plausible. A small confession. A small request. $40. That was all. Not enough to burden anyone. Just enough to reveal something. Courtney tilted her head, her blonde hair falling neatly over one shoulder, and reached for her phone with the kind of efficiency she brought to everything. "I can Venmo it," she said. "Though honestly, Ethan and I have been talking. At some point, it may be worth looking at whether staying on your own is the most practical option." There it was. Not cruelty. Not yet. Something cleaner than cruelty. Recalculation. She said practical the way some women say unfortunate, with sympathy polished so smooth it barely sounded like judgment. I gave her my best embarrassed smile and looked down at my hands. "It's just been a tighter month than usual," I said softly. I didn't want to make a fuss. Courtney touched my wrist, light and brief, the exact gesture a woman uses when she wants to appear compassionate without risking inconvenience. "Your family," she said. "We just need to be realistic." Family. It was a lovely word. She used it often. Usually when she needed me at Thanksgiving, or wanted me to bring my lemon bars, or needed someone dependable to sit through a school fundraiser and bid on silent auction baskets no one else wanted. Family, in Courtney's mouth, had always sounded generous. That afternoon, it sounded conditional. I left 20 minutes later with a soft promise, a digital transfer, and the unmistakable feeling that something invisible had just been adjusted. Courtney walked me to the door. She was all grace again. Warm. Polished. Thoughtful. But the temperature had changed. I felt it in the way she stopped asking if I'd like to stay for dinner. In the way her smile ended a second too early. In the way she said, "Drive safe," like she was already thinking past me. The late afternoon sun hit my windshield as I settled into my Bic, and for a moment I just sat there with my hands on the wheel, looking at the reflection of her spotless front windows. 2 weeks ago, she had kissed my cheek and called me family. That day, all it had taken was $40 for me to become a calculation. I started the engine, glanced once in the rearview mirror, and saw Courtney still standing in the doorway, watching me leave with the calm expression of a woman who believed she had finally learned exactly what I was worth. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I already knew I had not imagined it. Women my age are told all the time that we are too sensitive, too nostalgic, too quick to read meaning into harmless things. But there was nothing harmless about the way Courtney had looked at me once she believed I had become expensive. I let myself into the house, set my purse on the narrow table in the front hall, and stood there for a moment in the quiet. My home was modest, neat, and paid for. A 2-bedroom brick ranch on the edge of Maplewood, with white shutters that needed repainting and rose bushes I still trimmed myself every spring. It was not grand, but it was mine. The mortgage had been gone for 12 years. My car was old because I liked it. My coat was worn because it was warm. My habits looked plain to people who had never learned the difference between modesty and need. I moved into the kitchen and set the kettle on, more out of ritual than thirst. The late light stretched across my countertops in long gold bars, warming the old oak cabinets and the ceramic bowl of lemons by the sink. I had lived carefully since Harold died. Not fearfully. Carefully. There was a difference. My husband had been a cautious man with money, and one of the many gifts he left me was the freedom not to perform wealth for anyone. I had enough. More than enough, if one lived without trying to impress strangers. My investments were conservative. My bills were paid. My emergency fund could outlast most emergencies. I had no debt, no rent, and no appetite for the kind of spending Courtney treated like oxygen. She liked labels, upgrades, and homes that looked staged for resale. I liked quiet, clean windows, and not owing anybody a thing. Ethan had done well for himself, and I had been proud of that. He had earned his success honestly, built a respectable accounting firm, and learned early how to speak with confidence in rooms that used to make him nervous. He wore tailored jackets now and checked market reports with his morning coffee, but underneath all of that he was still the boy who used to leave dandelions on my kitchen counter in a jelly jar. Or at least I had believed he was. Courtney had arrived polished. She was not loud, not careless, not openly rude. That would have been easier. She was the kind of woman people describe as lovely because she understood the social value of timing. She remembered birthdays, sent flowers with tasteful cards, and never raised her voice at the table. She knew exactly how to be admired. She also knew exactly when admiration was useful. The first year Ethan brought her home, I told myself I was lucky. She was composed, well-dressed, and attentive in all the right ways. She brought expensive olive oil at Christmas, kissed my cheek at the door, and always called me Margaret in public and Mom when someone was listening. It was elegant. Convincing. For a while, I mistook polish for character. But over time I began to notice the small edits she made when money entered the room. The brightness in her voice sharpened when someone mentioned inheritance. Her attention became precise when real estate came up. She had a way of asking innocent questions that were never quite innocent. Had I ever considered downsizing? Did I really need such a large yard? Was I sure managing things alone was still wise? Always practical. Always reasonable. Always wrapped in concern so neat it took effort to call it what it was. I poured hot water into my teacup and stood at the sink, watching steam rise against the window. 2 weeks earlier, Courtney had called me family with her arms around my shoulders and a smile warm enough to pass for love. That afternoon she had looked at me like a balance sheet with declining value. And the most unsettling part was not how quickly she adjusted. It was how natural it seemed once she did. Once I started looking, I could not stop seeing it. That was the trouble with patterns. They were invisible right up until the moment they became obvious, and then they were everywhere. I began replaying the last 3 years with Courtney in small, ordinary flashes, the kind that seem too minor to matter until they begin lining up like pins on a board. She never forgot my birthday, but she always remembered it in proportion to who was watching. If we were alone, I got a polite call and a digital gift card sent at exactly 8 in the morning. If Ethan was there, I got flowers, a silk ribbon, and a warm embrace at brunch. When I gave her a hand-painted serving platter one Christmas, something lovely and old from a local artisan I had admired for years, she smiled, thanked me, and set it aside without looking at it twice. The next year, I contributed to the down payment on their kitchen remodel and she held my hands in both of hers like I had saved her life. She framed gratitude beautifully when it came with a dollar amount attached. It was subtle enough to miss if you wanted to miss it. I had wanted to. There were other things. Small things. The kind a woman excuses because they are easier to dismiss than confront. Courtney never called just to chat unless she needed. Something folded inside the conversation. Could I recommend a landscaper? Could I watch Oliver for 2 hours? Could I bring my silver serving set because hers was being polished? Could I come early and help set the table because she trusted my eye? She was clever about it. She never asked in a way that sounded selfish. She asked in ways that made usefulness feel like intimacy. And for a while, I let myself mistake being needed for being loved. I remembered the fundraiser at St. Andrew's School the year before, the one with dry chicken, folded bid cards, and auction baskets wrapped in cellophane. Courtney had insisted I come because family support mattered. She kissed my cheek in the lobby, looped her arm through mine, and introduced me to half the room with polished affection. "This is Margaret," she said. We would be lost without her. By the end of the night I had paid $600 for a lake weekend I did not want and a spa certificate I never used, and Courtney had thanked me with that same bright smile she wore whenever generosity could be converted into convenience. On the drive home, Ethan had talked about traffic. Courtney had talked about turnout. No one mentioned my check. Then there was Thanksgiving. I brought the pies, as always. 2 pumpkin, 1 pecan, 1 apple, all from scratch. Courtney took them from my hands at the door, kissed my cheek, and whispered that I was a lifesaver. An hour later I heard her in the kitchen telling a friend she did not know how women my age filled their time without becoming over-involved. I stood in the hallway holding a dish towel, listening to her laugh softly and say, "At least she likes feeling useful." She had not known I was there. That was what stayed with me. Not the remark itself. The ease of it. The casual certainty. It was never one large cruelty. That would have been easier to name. It was 100 polished transactions dressed as warmth. Every kindness arrived with clean edges. Every invitation had a function beneath it. Every compliment seemed to gain weight when money, access, or effort might follow. And once I saw that, I could not unsee the precision of her affection. Courtney was never careless. With people. She was strategic with them. She did not collect relationships. She assessed them. Measured them. Maintained them at the level of return they offered. And slowly, with a steadiness that unsettled me more than anger ever could, I began to understand that what I had taken for closeness all those years had been something much colder. Courtney had not been building a bond with me. She had been managing an asset. By Friday, I had decided 2 things. First, I was not imagining Courtney. Second, I was not going to accuse her of anything she had not plainly shown me herself. Women like Courtney survive on ambiguity. They rely on tone, timing, and the social instinct most people have to excuse what they would rather not name. If I confronted her too early, she would smile, tilt her head, and make me sound sentimental. I had no intention of giving her that advantage. So I decided to make myself smaller. Not in truth. In appearance. There is a difference, and by 6 to 9, a woman learns how much of the world responds to costume. The following Sunday, I dressed for lunch at their house with unusual care. Not to look elegant. To look diminished. I chose the older camel coat with the softened collar and the sensible low heels I usually saved for errands. I left my pearl earrings in the dish by the sink. I drove the Bic instead of the Lexus Harold had insisted I keep for long trips. It had been washed the day before, but it still looked its age, which was exactly the point. Before I left, I moved a small amount of money out of my checking account and into a separate line I rarely touched, leaving the balance lower in case anyone happened to glance at a statement left carelessly near my purse. Not a trap. Just a cleaner stage. I arrived 10 minutes late on purpose and apologized in the doorway with just enough embarrassment to sound believable. Courtney was arranging white hydrangeas in a vase on the dining table. She turned with that polished smile she wore like jewelry. "Margaret, come in. We were just getting settled." Her eyes dropped, briefly, to my coat. Then to the Bic in the driveway behind me. It was quick. Clinical. Nearly invisible. I kissed Ethan. On the cheek, handed Oliver the coloring book I had brought him, and let myself become quieter than usual. Less certain. Less useful. I waited until lunch was nearly over, until the plates had been cleared and the room had settled into that soft lull where people are least guarded. Then I set my coffee cup down and said, with practiced hesitation, "I hate to ask this, but I may need to tighten a few things for a while. My property taxes came in higher than expected, and I have been trying to decide whether to delay a few repairs." I kept my tone light. Matter of fact. Not dramatic enough to invite concern. Just vulnerable enough to register. Ethan looked up first. "How much higher?" he asked, already half in problem-solving mode. Before I could answer, Courtney spoke. "The market has been hard on everyone," she said, her voice warm and smooth. "A lot of people your age do not realize how quickly fixed income can become limiting. Your age. Not unkind. Not accidental." I smiled into my coffee. "I may need to be more careful for a while." Courtney folded her napkin and set it beside her plate. It might be wise, she said gently, to think ahead before things become stressful. There are lovely communities now. Smaller places. Less maintenance. More support. Ethan said nothing. He reached for his water glass and looked down. I let a beat pass, then added the smallest piece of bait. I was actually hoping you might know someone reliable for a minor roof repair. I have been putting it off. Courtney did not refuse. She did something far more revealing. She offered help the way banks offer sympathy. Of course, she said. Send me the estimate first. We should make sure you are not overspending on something that may not be worth fixing long term. There it was. Neat. Pleasant. Efficient. She was no longer speaking to me like family. She was speaking to me like a declining property. I nodded, thanked her, and let the conversation move on. Then I sat there, quiet and smiling, while Courtney refilled glasses, adjusted flowers, and began, with remarkable ease, to treat me exactly like someone whose value had started to fall. The change did not arrive all at once. That would have been too obvious. Courtney was too disciplined for that. It came in small omissions, the kind polite people can always explain if you ask them to. By Tuesday, she had stopped sending me the cheerful little messages she used to scatter through the week. No photo of Oliver in his soccer uniform. No link to a candle she thought I would love. No quick, affectionate check-in with a heart at the end of it. Silence, on its own, is easy to dismiss. But silence after warmth has a shape. It tells you exactly what has been withdrawn. On Wednesday, she called Ethan while I was there dropping off his tax folder, and I heard her voice through the half-open office door. Bright. Efficient. Can you remind your mother to send the contractor estimate before she commits to anything? At her stage, people tend to make emotional decisions about houses. At her stage. I stood in the hallway holding a manila envelope and looked at the framed degree on Ethan's wall, remembering the year I worked Saturdays to help cover his tuition when the scholarship fell short by $3,000. At my stage, apparently, memory had become sentiment and caution had become decline. Ethan took the folder from my hand 2 minutes later and smiled as though nothing had shifted. Thanks, Mom. Not Margaret. Not family. Just enough warmth to keep the machine running. I smiled back and watched how easily he accepted the revised version of me. By Thursday, Courtney had found a new tone entirely. It was almost impressive. She had not become rude. She had become managerial. She sent me the name of a roofing company with a note that read, "They are affordable and practical," which I had not asked for. She added that if I was considering larger repairs, it might make more sense to avoid putting money into a property I may not be keeping much longer. No insult. No raised voice. Just the clean language of asset reduction. I stared at the message for a long moment before setting my phone face down on the kitchen table. It was not cruelty in the theatrical sense. It was worse. It was the quiet efficiency of someone who had already begun reorganizing me into a smaller category. By Friday afternoon, I was no longer a woman Courtney performed affection for. I had become a situation to manage. She called to ask if I could still take Oliver on Saturday, then paused just long enough to make the request sound generous. Only if it is not too much right now, she said, in the tone one uses with people who have become fragile and inconvenient. I told her I would be delighted. She thanked me with the soft relief of someone pleased an old appliance still worked. When Oliver arrived the next morning, he came with his overnight bag, his favorite dinosaur, and a folded note in Courtney's neat handwriting listing snack preferences, bedtime reminders, and a sentence underlined twice. Please keep things simple. We are trying to help him understand that not everyone lives the same way. I read it twice, then set it carefully beside the fruit bowl. Not everyone lives the same way. There it was. Not concern. Not even disguise. Just the beginning of narrative. I made Oliver pancakes, took him to the park, let him beat me 3 times at checkers, and listened while he explained in solemn detail that his mother said Grandma's car was old because old people had to be careful with money. He said it innocently, reaching for another strawberry. Children do not lie well. They repeat. I smiled, handed him the syrup, and felt something inside me settle into place with a clarity so complete it almost felt like calm. Courtney had not failed loudly. She had failed cleanly. No tantrum. No cruelty dramatic enough to defend against. Just the steady withdrawal of warmth the moment she believed I no longer represented comfort, leverage, or return. And that was what made it final. It was not what she said when she thought I was listening. It was what she stopped pretending once she thought I was no longer worth the effort. The sentence that ended any remaining doubt reached me 3 days later, soft as silk and twice as cold. Courtney had invited me over on Wednesday evening to look through a few old family photographs for Oliver's school project. It was the sort of request she used to make often, practical enough to sound thoughtful, sentimental enough to feel flattering. I arrived just after 6 with a small envelope of pictures from Ethan's childhood and found the house unusually quiet. Ethan was still at the office. Oliver was upstairs with his tutor. Courtney called from the kitchen that she would be just a minute and told me to make myself comfortable in the den. I set the envelope on the coffee table and sat down in the long blue chair by the window, the one she always said was the best seat in the house. A minute later her phone rang in the kitchen. I did not mean to listen. I simply had nowhere else to place my ears. Her voice was easy at first, low and amused in the way women speak when they are certain they are among allies. I could not hear the other side of the conversation, only the familiar cadence of Courtney becoming more honest with someone she did not need to impress. She laughed once, quietly. "No, it is not a crisis," she said. "It is just becoming one of those situations." A pause. The clink of a glass against the counter. She is fine for now, but it is different when someone stops being independent and starts becoming logistical. I sat very still in the blue chair with my hands folded in my lap. Her voice drifted in cleanly from the next room, unhurried and warm. "That is what Ethan does not understand. His mother was much easier to love when she was useful." She laughed again, softer this time, as though she had said something clever rather than cruel. "I know that sounds terrible, but you know what I mean. Some people are charming when they are generous. Then age happens, money tightens, and suddenly you are managing emotion, maintenance, and guilt." She lowered her voice after that, but not enough. I caught enough to hear my house referred to as inevitable, my habits described as outdated, and my life reduced to a timing issue. Timing. Not grief. Not dignity. Not family. Timing. I do not remember moving at first. Only the sensation of my spine straightening against the chair. It was not shock, not exactly. Shock is loud. This was something quieter. Something colder. It was the feeling of a final piece sliding neatly into place. Courtney had not merely reassessed me. She had translated me. She had taken everything I was. Everything I had offered, and converted it into burden, maintenance, and delay. A few seconds later she stepped into the den carrying 2 glasses of iced tea and smiling as though she had not just stripped the skin off 15 years of performance. "There you are," she said brightly. "I hope you do not mind waiting." I looked up at her, at the polished ease of her face, the careful softness in her voice, and understood something that made anger unnecessary. Courtney was not careless enough to be monstrous. She was careful enough to be believed. That was what made women like her dangerous. Not because they screamed. Because they smiled. I took the glass from her hand and thanked her. She sat across from me, tucked one leg neatly beneath herself, and began sorting through the old photographs with the same elegant concentration she brought to flower arrangements and social damage. "This one is sweet," she said, lifting a picture of Ethan at 7 in a paper crown. "Oliver will love seeing how simple birthdays used to be." Simple. There it was again. A lovely word used like a knife wrapped in linen. I smiled, nodded, and let her continue. By then I no longer needed proof. I had heard the sentence beneath every smile she had ever given me. And once a person tells you what your value is in their private language, there is no going back to misunderstanding it. I left Courtney's house that evening with the photographs in my lap and her voice still echoing in my ears, but it was Ethan I thought about on the drive home. Courtney had said what she thought because she believed she was safe enough to say it. That much was clear. What lingered, what settled into me with a weight I had not prepared for, Was the quiet certainty beneath her tone when she said his mother was easier to love when she was useful. She had not spoken like a woman taking a risk. She had spoken like a woman repeating something already proven. I spent the next 2 days watching my son with the kind of attention only a mother can bring to disappointment. Not looking for cruelty. Looking for consent. It arrived in pieces so ordinary they might have passed for nothing if I had still been willing to excuse him. Friday morning, Ethan called while I was trimming basil in the kitchen. He asked how I was, listened just long enough to satisfy the shape of the question, then cleared his throat and told me Courtney had mentioned my roof. Maybe do not put too much into the house right now, he said, the same way a banker might caution against over-improving a property before sale. If things are tightening, you should think long-term. There was no concern in it. Only administration. I looked at the basil leaves in my hand and realized he was not asking what I needed. He was preparing me to need less. That afternoon he stopped by to drop off Oliver's backpack and stood in my kitchen for all of 8 minutes. He noticed the new butcher block I had installed by the stove and frowned as though I had made an irresponsible decision. You probably should have waited on extras, he said. Extras. I had paid cash for it 6 months earlier because I liked the warmth of wood under afternoon light. Ethan did not ask why I had chosen it. He had already accepted the version of me Courtney had handed him. By Sunday, I had enough to stop hoping he was merely distracted. They came for dinner just after 5. Courtney brought wine she knew I would not open. Oliver brought a spelling test and wanted praise. Ethan brought the soft, careful tone people use in hospitals and legal offices. He offered to look over my monthly expenses. Not because I had asked. Because, as he put it, it might help everyone if we had a clearer picture. Everyone. Such a tidy word for such a small betrayal. I stood at the stove stirring gravy while he sat at my kitchen table, and asked whether I had considered consolidating. Whether I still needed both bedrooms. Whether managing alone was realistic. Courtney said very little. She did not need to. She sat beside him, quiet and composed, letting him do what weak men often do best. Deliver someone else's conclusion in their own voice. That was the moment something in me settled for good. Ethan was not cruel. Cruelty would have required intention sharp enough to name. Ethan was something softer and, in its own way, more painful. He was convenient. He had allowed Courtney to interpret me for him because it spared him the discomfort of seeing me clearly. He had accepted her language because it made difficult things sound practical. He had mistaken ease for wisdom and silence for fairness. When dinner ended, he carried his plate to the sink, kissed my cheek, and thanked me for the meal with the distracted tenderness of a man who still believed good manners could cover moral laziness. After they left, I stood in the kitchen alone, looking at 3 rinsed wine glasses drying upside down on the rack. I thought of all the years I had taught Ethan to be kind. To notice who was carrying what. To stand up straight when something mattered. Somewhere along the way he had learned a different lesson. Not to wound. Not to defend. To let comfort make decisions and call it peace. Courtney may have assessed my value, but Ethan had done something quieter. He had watched her reduce me and decided it was easier to let her be right. Once I understood what they were willing to believe about me, I stopped correcting them. That was the easiest part, and perhaps the most revealing. People tell the truth fastest when they think the story is already settled. So I let it settle. I let Courtney believe the roof was a burden I could not manage. I let Ethan believe my checking account required concern. I let both of them continue speaking around me in that softened, careful tone reserved for aging relatives and failing investments. And in return, they became astonishingly honest. I declined dinner out twice in the same week and mentioned, lightly, that restaurant prices had become absurd. Courtney stopped suggesting brunch altogether. She switched to inviting me over only when there was a reason attached. Could I watch Oliver for an hour? Could I sign for a package? Could I bring the deviled eggs because guests were coming and she was behind? The invitations were still polite. They were simply stripped of decoration. I had become useful again, but only in smaller denominations. Ethan began forwarding me articles about downsizing. Quietly. Casually. A townhouse in a managed community. A senior development with walking trails and low maintenance. A piece on the wisdom of simplifying later life before crisis forced the issue. He sent them the way decent men send uncomfortable ideas when they hope not to be blamed for having them. No discussion. Just links. I thanked him and said I would think about it. That answer pleased him more than it should have. By the second week, Courtney had grown visibly more comfortable in the version of me she had constructed. She no longer bothered performing warmth unless someone else was present to witness it. When it was just the two of us, her kindness became efficient. She answered quickly, smiled on schedule, and stopped pretending affection was spontaneous. One Thursday afternoon, I arrived early to return Oliver's jacket and found her in the driveway on the phone with a neighbor. She saw me, lifted one manicured finger in greeting, and kept talking. "It is not dramatic," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "It is just one of those transitions families have to manage when parents start becoming dependent." Dependent. She smiled at me while saying it, as though the word itself were harmless. I smiled back and waited until she ended the call. It is astonishing what people will say in front of you once they decide you no longer count as a full witness. That Saturday, she hosted a late summer dinner for 6 on the patio. Linen napkins. Candlelight. Grilled salmon. 2 couples from Ethan's office and 1 woman from Oliver's school committee. I arrived with the lemon tart she had asked me to make and watched Courtney take it from my hands without looking at me, already turning to greet someone she considered more current. For the first hour, I was treated with the decorative courtesy reserved for older women in tasteful houses. Introduced kindly. Seated neatly. Spoken around. Then one of the men, a partner from Ethan's firm, admired my bracelet and asked if it was vintage. Before I could answer, Courtney laughed softly and said, "Margaret has wonderful old pieces. She is in that practical stage now where she is learning what is sentimental and what is worth keeping." It landed exactly as she intended. Light enough to pass as conversation. Sharp enough to reduce. There was a polite murmur around the table, the quick social silence of people who recognize cruelty but prefer manners. I set my water glass down and watched Courtney smile into the candlelight, perfectly composed, perfectly certain. She had become so comfortable with my supposed decline that she no longer bothered hiding what she thought of me. That was the gift of patience. Given enough room, people stop performing and start revealing. And Courtney, now certain I was smaller than I had been, had finally become careless enough to be seen. The following Tuesday, I invited them to dinner. Nothing elaborate. Roast chicken, green beans with shallots, the good china, cloth napkins pressed that afternoon. I set the table the way I always had when something mattered, carefully and without announcement. Courtney arrived 10 minutes late in a cream sweater and that composed expression she wore when she expected to be gracious on purpose. Ethan followed with a bottle of wine he knew I would not open. Oliver carried a spelling worksheet and asked if there would be dessert. I told him there always was. The evening began exactly as Courtney preferred such evenings to begin, polished and easy. She complimented the table. Ethan commented on the weather. Oliver talked about a science quiz. I served dinner, refilled glasses, and let the rhythm settle into something calm enough to make what came next impossible to mistake. It happened over coffee. Ethan had just finished saying something forgettable about quarterly projections when Courtney glanced around my dining room, rested her fingertips on the rim of her cup, and smiled the way women smile when they intend to sound thoughtful and land somewhere else entirely. "You have kept this place up remarkably well," she said. "Although at a certain point, I suppose sentiment becomes expensive." There was the briefest pause. Just enough for the room to register what she had done. Then she continued, smooth as ever. "Still, not everyone knows when to let go of what no longer makes practical sense." Ethan looked down. Oliver reached for a cookie. No one spoke. It was small. Elegant. Public. Exactly the kind of cruelty Courtney trusted most because it arrived dressed as reason. I set my coffee cup down on its saucer and folded my napkin in my lap. Then I looked at her and smiled. "You are absolutely right," I said. "Practicality matters. Which is why I thought this would be the right time to clarify a few things. Ethan glanced up then, wary in the way people become when a room changes shape around them. Courtney held my gaze, still smiling, still certain she understood the script. I reached for the leather folder I had placed beside the sideboard before they arrived and set it gently on the table. Not dramatically. Not with anger. Just within reach. The roof was replaced last spring, I said. Paid in full. The kitchen butcher block Ethan disapproved of was installed 6 months ago. Also paid in full. My property taxes were not a strain. My pharmacy bill is not a burden. And I have not needed financial help from anyone in this room. Courtney's smile did not disappear. It faltered. Just slightly. I opened the folder and slid one page across the table. Then another. Statements. Investment summaries. The deed to this house. A copy of the trust Harold and I established 12 years ago, updated every January since his death. Ethan stared at the paper nearest him without touching it. Courtney's eyes moved faster. She was still trying to calculate her way out of surprise. I never had a money problem, I said, and my voice remained so calm it startled even me. I had a clarity problem. I wanted to know how I would be treated if I stopped being useful to you in the ways you prefer. No one interrupted. Even Oliver looked up. Courtney opened her mouth, but I raised one hand, not sharply, just enough. You do not need to explain what I heard. Or what you both made plain. I looked at Ethan then, not with anger, but with the steady disappointment only a mother can deliver without lifting her voice. You were not cruel. That would have required conviction. You were simply comfortable letting someone else reduce me because it made your life easier. He looked as though I had struck something far deeper than pride. Then I turned to Courtney. She sat very still, one hand resting against the table, polished and silent and, for the first time since I had known her, visible. You were kind when kindness paid well, I said. That is not warmth. That is strategy. I closed the folder, folded my hands, and let the silence do what anger never could. You were both so busy preparing me to become smaller that neither of you noticed I was only stepping back far enough to see you clearly. Then I reached for my coffee, took one measured sip, and said the only thing left worth saying. The trust has been amended. What I leave, and to whom, will now reflect character instead of proximity. Dessert is in the kitchen if anyone still wants it.